the webinar today, but with the change of date from last week, quite a few of those have indicated to me that they will be looking for the recording. So we will get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Georgia Henry. My company is called Henry Reid. We're an organisation culture consultancy. So the background of our consultants is predominantly in human resources and organisation development and design. I've been working in corporate HR for more than 25 years for Australian subsidiaries of multinational organisations, large family businesses and large national organisations across industries. And 3 years ago started Henry Reid out of a passion for people and performance, and really looking at what makes a difference in organisations when we want to look at how to optimise results and mitigate risk and create competitive advantage. And for me, it always comes back to people and culture. And so what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit around how we work with organisations to optimise organisational effectiveness and what that looks like, because I think a lot of organisations actually start to focus in the wrong areas. So I've shared my screen there with you. I will have a presentation, but as I said, if you've got questions as we go through, please type them into the chat function as we go through, and I'll answer those as they come up and look to do those at the end as well. So optimising, hello, welcome. Optimising organisational effectiveness is really important when we're faced with change. And I think everyone would agree at the moment we're in a situation of incredible change that's been forced upon us rather than change that's actually been planned for. But change in organisations comes from a lot of different areas. It could be when organisations are faced with significant growth or decline, changing market conditions, mergers and acquisitions, changes of leadership, and even key people coming in and out of the business quite often change the direction of an organisation. It could be when you're faced with strategic, operational, or technological change, or looking at the external impacts and influences, things like the pandemic we're experiencing at the moment, and then also changes in compliance and regulation. And these types of change means that organisations constantly have to manage change and adapt to these different conditions. And the reason that's important is because when you're continually adapting and changing and making improvements, you are improving the organisation's effectiveness and the ability to then translate that into the strategic results, so which means shareholder value, revenue, profit, and other things such as competitive advantage, productivity. And also with improvements and looking at organisational effectiveness, quite often comes cost reduction. And cost reduction in terms of operating costs, but employee turnover, and looking at how you actually mitigate risks within a business. So interpreting and responding to change is a constant requirement for leaders, and it's a constant requirement for organisations to remain effective. But from my perspective, many organisations begin looking at organisational effectiveness in the wrong way. They start with a false start by heading straight to strategy. And I've had this discussion with many CEOs that strategy has to come first. There needs to be a strong strategic direction to be able to impact organisational effectiveness or organisation change. But when we look to manage change and improve organisational effectiveness, it's well documented and recognised that more than 70% of change processes fail because they're not supported by the culture of the organisation. And so if we're looking at strategic direction and taking a focus on strategy as the first point, we're actually not going to optimise organisational effectiveness because we haven't understood and designed culture to be able to support the strategy. And that's a really important factor when we look at all of these scenarios and situations we're in at the moment, where the change has been forced upon us. And we're working with many clients who are realizing now that as they try and implement changes, their culture and the way of doing things doesn't actually support it to allow it to be effective. So culture, and a definition of culture that's quite common, is the way we do things around here. It's an explanation of behaviours, attitudes, shared values, actions, and unwritten ground rules. And all of these things, are individual. They come from the people within the business. And it's a lot of people ask, if we have all these intangible behaviours and attitudes and actions, all these elements to culture, how then can it then be understood and designed to optimise organisational effectiveness? And so it's when we've been sort of working with CEOs, quite often we mention organisation culture and we start to talk about intangibles, and you can see them glaze over because leaders like to know and work with more tangible concepts. And so we've developed a model of organisational effectiveness which really helps us clearly explain what the link is between culture and strategy and optimising organisational effectiveness. So this is a very simple framework. And it starts off with a number of different layers, and it starts off with the foundation of identity. And that is the key elements or key culture drivers of purpose, vision, and values. So purpose, I think most people have heard of Simon Sinek and his series Start With Why. Purpose is the why of the organisation. It's closely linked with the vision, like where are we headed, and the values driving how things are going to be done. That's the foundation of the identity of an organisation. It's then supported by a firm framework for action, which is where the CEOs and executives like to play. It's tangible, it's around strategy, governance, and risk. The third element there is the environment for success, and that impacts those behaviours and actions. It helps create the environment for the unwritten ground rules and for where change happens. And the final layer is the alignment, engagement, and accountability, which is how does this structure actually impact the people who are associated with your business? It's not only employees, it could be customers, it could be suppliers, business partners, and other key stakeholders. But when all of these things work together and connect and are optimised, then you start to have the framework for a very effective organisation. So if we break that down a little bit further and we consider culture as the key element of organisational effectiveness, and we look at that centre foundation of identity, and we look at purpose, vision, and values, the why, what, and how of the business. This is an area when we do strategy facilitation, and we maybe take strategy, put it to one side for a second and say, let's look at these foundations of identity. It can make people quite nervous. Why do we need to do this? We know the direction that we're headed in, particularly for existing businesses. So I want to share an example of a client that we're currently working with. And a couple of months ago, we started with a review of their purpose, vision, and values. It's an organisation that has existed for 30 years. And we went back to, why does this business exist? Why was it started? And really fleshed out the reason for the business. And it became really clear when we started to explore that, and how what the business looks like today, and what is the vision for the business in the future. The business owner actually identified that they'd lost their way. They actually weren't running the business true to the purpose, true to what they believed. And then doing the values discovery of what's important to them in the behaviours, how they interact. They also identified that having lost their way from the purpose of the organisation and really not staying true to values, they were actually interacting with customers that they didn't have great relationships with because they didn't have a shared value. So having this understanding of these key elements of culture and culture drivers, it becomes easier to understand why then we must use culture as a management tool. It builds the foundation for organisational effectiveness. And taking that through then to be able to look at the framework to deliver results, which is strategy, governance, and risk, you can actually develop a much more effective strategy, understanding and really having agreement and clarity on why the business exists, where it's going to go, and what are the values that are really important, because that impacts the way the strategic direction, the identification of strategic outcomes, right through to the development of goals and KPIs that need to then get rolled down to every individual within the business. Looking at the governance, the systems and structures, what is the framework for running the business, the policies. These things are really important to understand, but ensuring that they are aligned back to that purpose, vision, and values. And a really important area that we consider whenever we're developing strategy with a client is risk, and the risk of strategy and governance, and particularly the risk of culture, I think is often not given enough area of focus. So one of the things we hear about in the news all the time, organisations that have been very successful organisations, but there's been some type of incident or a downturn, and we can name some from the finance industry or aged care industry, or companies like Dreamworld or Cricket Australia, or even Amnesty International. Over the last few years, there's been many examples. When they actually say what's gone wrong, why has there been a downfall, they're not citing strategy, they're citing culture, and the culture as being the area where an organisation becomes less effective and open to risk. Needs to be a strong area of focus. It could be financial risk or reputation, legal or compliance, safety and quality. There's a huge amount of risk. And the majority of risk comes from within an organisation, from the people who are working within the business, whether they're going to act ethically or not, or follow the rules or not, or behave in a way that actually takes the business forward or doesn't. So risk is an area that needs to be considered when we're looking at organisational effectiveness, and particularly the impact of culture. In that third area of the model, we talked about the environment that's created. An environment that's created actually becomes where we start to see demonstration of examples of culture. And it's highly impacted by leaders, because leaders create that environment. They set the standards, they manage the performance, they either act consistently or not, they communicate with clarity or not. They create the environment, the sense of care or community, and really show a commitment. So leadership has a significant impact on organisational effectiveness when we start to look at that environment that's created. And I'm sure everyone can recognise times that have worked in a business where the leader has created a fantastic environment, and then the leader's changed and the culture has deteriorated because a different leader has approached it differently. Or even looking at different leaders across an organisation and seeing the inconsistencies or a lack of commitment, or the differences in leadership styles, and how that starts to undermine a culture and have a negative impact on the effectiveness of delivering on strategic outcomes. So leadership, and looking at how leaders role model, how they make decisions, the standards that they set, and their actions and reactions, is a key part of organisational effectiveness, in addition to the strategy, governance and risk. And then there's the impact. So once we start thinking about the impact that this all has, and if you can imagine an organisation that has a clearly defined purpose, a aspirational vision for the future, and values that are believed and lived and demonstrated, and all of this translates into a clear strategic direction where the outcomes are defined and every person knows how they connect to the delivery of that strategy. They know the framework and the structure and the rules and the guidelines and the boundaries that they're working within, and what risk is acceptable and what is not. And they have leaders who are supportive and who have created the environment to enable success. What you have then is you have a really cohesive story to tell. You have employees who then start to demonstrate discretionary effort, who start to innovate. They're very aligned, and they participate because they have a real sense of connection to delivering on that organisation's purpose through the strategy and through the systems and structures and working in the environment. They take accountability because they know what's expected, and they know what's acceptable. They understand how to behave, those boundaries, and they're generally very highly engaged. And what happens when we have an employee cohort that is aligned, accountable, and engaged, we see a direct translation of that into customers and the representation of the brand, and going beyond customers as well to suppliers and business partners and organisations that you work with. And you create a connection from the internal business to the external business, which is those people that we are wanting to engage and have a strong connection with, and certainly to ensure that we are delivering the product and achieving those strategic results. So the impact, all of these things work together to create an optimised organisation that's very, very effective. But when some of these levers or some of these drivers of organisational effectiveness aren't working, we start to see cracks. Things start to fall apart. And so when we start to look as a business, we start to work with the client to look at where is it going wrong. We don't look at culture as being only those behaviours and attitudes and actions and unwritten ground rules. We actually have a comprehensive process, and it's really important to take into consideration that there are all of these elements impacting the way employees behave and the way that results are delivered. So we start with understanding, and we need to understand what is actually happening in the business right now. And what we found by working with our clients is that quite often the understanding we obtain from a culture audit is slightly different. They might have an idea or an understanding of some key areas of issue within their business, but having an external view, an external person or organisation come into a culture audit shines a different light. We're looking at it from a different viewpoint, and that ensures that we are able to highlight the areas that need the most action and attention. So our process looks at the surveys, so finding out what is the sentiment of board members, of executives, of leaders, and of employees through the business. We then also look at that strategy, governance, and risk areas. So we look at business metrics. What is the business measuring at the moment? What does the strategic plan look like? Does that actually link back to purpose and vision? Is the governance and the risk being identified to actually support where the business needs to go? And quite often there's gaps in the systems and processes that are defined that create the rules for engagement for employees and the way things are done, and what is actually needing to be achieved. And that can happen really simply because quite often as businesses grow and evolve, those policies or systems or structures haven't kept up with what's needed to enable employees to actually deliver those results. So we look at identifying the gaps in effectiveness and the opportunities for improvement by looking at business metrics in a document review. We then validate a lot of that data with interviews with executives and key stakeholders and focus groups to deep dive and examine the impact. And this is where we really get to understand the environment that's been created, the impact that's having on employees and on leaders, and really to identify the roadblocks and the unwritten ground rules that are holding the business back from being effective. And the final element before we present a report is we can do a risk assessment. And a lot of people have asked us why we do a risk assessment, which is generally more aligned to doing a safety audit or a quality audit. Well, just as you would do a risk assessment for a safety audit, we do a risk assessment on the culture risk, because as I said before, the risk comes from within the organisation. And if we can identify and quantify the impact of that risk, it actually helps provide the business case for change. And it helps prioritise the areas to focus on. And it helps an organisation really understand the importance of addressing these issues to keep up with the constant changes and to be able to continue to adapt, to make sure that not only optimising the organisation effectiveness, they're delivering on their strategic results, but they're mitigating the risks as well. So the culture audit process is the first step to really understanding where are the gaps in the business or the challenges in the business that need to be investigated. And then we move into a culture design process. And this culture design process incorporates all of those different areas. So we go back to starting looking at defining identity and looking at the impacts of purpose, vision and values. Are they still relevant, particularly for organisations that have been established for some time? Are they relevant? Does the terminology or the language need to be updated? Does it still engage the employees? Is it relevant in the changing market? And quite often we find that when purpose has been really well defined and the values are understood and lived, there may not be a great deal of change or any change. But when we see there's a disconnect, once we reconnect the business back to why it exists in the first place, what its aspirational vision is for the future, and what is important for the behaviours and the values in the organisation, it actually has such a positive shift to then go to that next stage, which is developing strategy and looking at the governance and risk areas and defining what that needs to look like to be able to create a culture that's going to support the strategic outcomes. In the culture design too, we always must look from the outside in. We need to look at how we connect, what is the connection to customer and brand of the culture that's been created internally. If you're going to be a really service-focused organisation or an organisation that has a high focus on care, how does that actually translate from the internal environment to the delivery of service or the provision of a product externally? Because everything that we do here is to make sure the organisation is working effectively to deliver the best outcomes and results. So we workshop that connection to customer and brand and what we need to deliver internally to make sure that those two things work together. Of course, looking at employee experience and employee value proposition is an important part, because everything that happens within your business is delivered through people, and ensuring that those employees are able to deliver what is needed is really the key to ensuring that you're able to have a business that's delivering on its strategic outcomes. We look at leadership, structure and environment, as I've said, that influence on leadership. And we look at leadership capability. The same with as businesses evolve and governance structures and systems may not have evolved with the business. We find sometimes particular leaders and their level of capability or understanding hasn't evolved with the business, and it's an area that can be has to be addressed and worked through to make sure leaders are having the most positive impact on the organisation. And similarly with structure, I think following this pandemic, we're going to see changes in organisational structure, which I think are incredibly positive. A change from very hierarchical, rigid structure to allow organisations to become more adaptable and flexible. The requirement of people coming and working in an office I hope will change. It means that organisations aren't just recruiting talent from within a small geographical region around an office environment, but can actually find the best person for their job or for their organisation globally or within an extended area. So I think structure is an area that's going to be more important as we start to move forward, looking at organisational effectiveness and adaptability moving forward. And then we need to measure the culture impact and the return on investment. So when we do culture design, it's not just about let's create the feel-good environment. There needs to actually be measurable culture impact and return on investment. And the way that we do that is we're looking at those business metrics. So we want to be able to see that there is a shift because of the culture that's been designed, whether that's in employee turnover or absenteeism rates, if it's measured by productivity, which could be revenue dollars per full-time equivalent labour hour, it could be cost of claims or number of incidents. There's a whole lot of measures that we can do to make sure that we are designing the culture that's actually going to deliver results for the business. And once it's designed, we need to manage this as a change process. And I think there needs to be more focus in so many areas of organisations around understanding change management, because most things that we do within a business require a change, whether it's a change of process or procedure, whether it is a significant change like a shift in culture and shift in behaviours, or it's a technology, the implementation of a new system. As an organisation, we can create that framework. We can create, this is what it looks like. We've got the structure, we've got the systems. And that provides the framework for change. But organisations don't change. It's the individuals within organisations that actually change and have to change their behaviours to make it effective and to make the change happen. So with the culture change, once we've gone through identifying the areas that are required, designing the culture, we provide support and management of change through a change process, because we need to take organisations from their current state to that future state. So we use very simply that ADKAR model, the awareness of the need to change, desire to support change, knowledge of how to change, ability to change, and reinforcement. And what we find a lot of organisations do when they are wanting to make change, they jump straight in asking employees to fit into that ability section. This is the change that we want. Now we want you to develop, demonstrate those skills and behaviours. And that's where we find resistance, and we find sabotage, and we find people feeling fearful and not being able to implement the change. And that's why change fails, because we haven't taken them through that change journey. So we're nearly coming up to half an hour already of going through the Optimising Organisational Effectiveness. I just wanted to run through some key points for you. Optimising organisational effectiveness is a complex process, but it is a process, and it can be understood when you use a framework or a model such as our model for organisational effectiveness. The starting point is to understand the current situation. It needs to be based on facts and evidence and without bias. And one of the things that we've noticed is that when we're working with organisations to do that culture audit, we find out a lot of information because we are external to the business, and we present the information that we find. I get comments a lot of times from CEOs or from other executives is that the information that they're presented with is often filtered, or it is presented in a way that has a bias or a slant because it is from people within the organisation. So one of the benefits of collaborating with someone externally is that you get the information presented as facts and without bias. For organisational effectiveness, we must put culture ahead of strategy. Starting with strategy first is not going to address the key issues of how to support the effectiveness of delivering on strategic outcomes. The next stage, the other area, is designing your organisation to remove the roadblocks and enable effectiveness. This is looking at the structure, the roles and responsibilities, the way there are interactions between areas of the business. Are we siloed or not siloed? Does information flow easily throughout the organisation? We also need to consider the capability of leadership, and we need capable leaders to create the environment and support the employees to be able to deliver results. And I've put down in the last point there an infinite mindset to accept change and continually adapt. So most people have heard of a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. An infinite mindset has been talked about by Simon Sinek, and it's really taking it more than just going to a growth mindset. It's actually being able to look beyond boundaries and being able to understand that change and adaptation is going to be a requirement for everyone in business, and looking at those opportunities and being able to accept change and continually adapt. And when we're looking at organisational effectiveness, I think that's one of the key areas, is that we are not stuck in the way things have always been done. We're not stuck in a mindset created from the legacy of the organisation that we work with, but we create opportunities by looking at things differently and with an infinite mindset. And the reason this is all important is because optimising organisational effectiveness does result in improved financial and non-financial results. We've seen the benefits through the organisations that we work with. There's strong return on investment that's measurable when we start to work with organisations. There's a definite mitigation of risk, and risk, remember, comes from within, comes from the people within the business. And so if we can mitigate those risks, then we are able to deliver greater results. And it creates competitive advantage. So competitive advantage, not just for the way that our brand is perceived in the marketplace or our interaction with customers, but also with the advantages being an employer of choice, and looking at our competitive advantage for being able to attract and retain talent within the organisation as well. So look, that's sort of the end of this webinar. These are short webinars that I hope you have enjoyed and got something out. If you have any questions, please take yourself off mute, and we can. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, or type those into the chat function. We will be doing another 2 webinars in the next couple of weeks. Next one is the same time, Wednesday next week, which is about improving productivity and engagement, and it's a case study. And it's a case study from when I worked with Nikon. I was head of HR for Nikon Australia, and I really want to share with you the good and the bad. I guess it's a realistic, imperfect example of what we were tasked to do and how we delivered it, and what I would do differently if I actually had the understanding of culture and organisational effectiveness that I do now. So I really love to share that with you next Wednesday. And in 2 weeks after that, on the 3rd of June, we're going to deep dive into cultural audits and share information and data that we've identified from working with a number of our clients, and show you how taking a data-driven approach to culture actually provides really useful insight. So I want to share some data from cultural audits that we've done with clients and show you about the impact that has had on organisations. So I'm not hearing or seeing any questions coming through. I can just see in the chat function there, Kelly's shared the link to book those webinars. If you're not registered for the next 2 webinars, please jump on in or register for the webinars. And if you're unable to attend, we will send you the recording. And the other thing that I want to make you aware of is if you're thinking about the organisational effectiveness within your organisation and want to get an understanding of how things are working and is it actually working effectively, I invite you to take a culture self-assessment. So it's at culturefirst.com.au. Kelly's just added that into the chat as well. Culturefirst.com.au. It's an online assessment, or it's 10 questions, which will start to highlight some of the areas that might indicate that your organisation is not as effective as it could be. And once you've done that, I'm always more than happy to run through a discovery session with you or your organisation, so we can start to look at what might be the best ways to move forward. Okay, anyone have any questions? Happy for you to jump off mute if you would like to ask any questions. No? Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us on the webinar next week at the same time, and in 2 weeks' time as well. And if there's anything that we can assist you with in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, either by phone, email, or by doing our culture self-assessment. So thank you, everyone, and wish you a very happy rest of the afternoon. Thank you.